Welcome to the New Models podcast. On this episode, we speak with theorist Benjamin Bratton about his new book, Revenge of the Real: Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, which comes out today, June 29th, from Verso Press. This episode is brought to you by CoQuo, a Berlin-based organization which works across art, tech, and the sciences with the aim of collectively shifting the status quo. This month, CoQuo has facilitated a program on music futures and simulacra, following a conversation with artist Sui Zhen on Refuge Worldwide Radio. The first workshop, Decrypt and Delineate, was a live discussion with Sherry Hugh, Matt Dryhurst, Zola Jesus, Chloe Alexandra Thomas, the artist Verite, and Mikhail Stengel to debrief the NFT mania, sorting the hype from the true innovation. The second workshop, Digital Skin, took place last week and looked at the future role of avatars in music, particularly in regards to celebrity and pop stardom. Among the guests was Trevor McFedries of Rudd and Friends with Benefits. The last segment happens tomorrow, June 30th at 6 p.m. Berlin time, 12 noon in New York, 9 a.m. in LA, live on CoQuo's recently launched Discord. Hit the link in the episode post for entry and to hear your New Models host speaking with CoQuo founder Caitlin Davies about community formation beyond Web 2.0 platforms. You can also find links to all of the aforementioned content on CoQuo's site, co:/quo.co. And now, Benjamin Bratton returns to the New Models podcast to discuss his new book, Revenge of the Real. So today we're speaking with Benjamin Bratton, who is a professor of visual arts at the University of California, San Diego. He directs the terraforming program at Moscow's Strelka Institute of Media, Architecture, and Design, and is perhaps best known to the general public for authoring his 2016 book, The Stack, on software and sovereignty. Benjamin, welcome back to the New Models podcast. Where are you calling in from today?
I'm actually in San Diego, California, which is near America. This is where I waited out the pandemic. It's bunkered down.
I see. Yes, you look like you're in a bunker of some kind there with the shuttered windows or something behind you. You look properly bunkered.
Thank you.
Well, we're very happy that you're willing to come on the show and speak to us again, this time about your new book, The Revenge of the Real: Politics for a Post-Pandemic World. When we last recorded together, it was 2019. I can't believe it's been 2 years, but it has been. Benjamin, you were in Berlin and the world did feel fundamentally different. That said, the conversation that we had then, or rather the systemic models that you offered during that conversation, this idea of a sentient Earth coming to know itself, mapped out a prescient vision of the physical universe and humanity's place within it that would only become more apparent as a global pandemic placed it into high relief this past year. Written with great energy, your new book is a self-described polemic, which very rapidly hits the reader with several key paradigm-shifting revelations that the pandemic, or as we like to say, syndemic, we can unpack that later, has laid bare. It's difficult to choose one to begin with, so feel welcome to offer an alternate. But this view of an epidemiological view of society was particularly resonant. So perhaps we could start there. Could you explain what you mean by this line, and in so doing, maybe voice any other macro shifts you feel have come into focus since we last talked?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. Yeah, so the epidemiological mode of society, I suppose, is really comes from my own experience watching the pandemic sort of move as a wave towards the shores. Those of us who have a lot of friends and colleagues in China were watching with horror what was going on there, and then probably felt a little bit Cassandra-like, sort of waiting for this to arrive here, where everyone seemed to be sitting on their hands, not really aware of what was coming. And so if you sort of think back to those early months, looking at these epidemiological maps of contagion numbers and vectors and locations and the rest of this, and it became clear that, not only were we watching and trying to map how close the wolf was to the door, But it was also a kind of mapping of oneself in relationship to this event or situation as it was unfolding. It was a rather different kind of relationship between oneself and the social than what you might learn in a traditional sociological or political theory course, which are traditionally organized around notions of relationships between the individual and the collective, the individual and society, different kinds of semiotic or discursive relationships between obligations and freedom and all the rest of this. And it became clear that that's not really what was happening here, that something more fundamental and perhaps elemental about one's situation and relationship to the world as a biological creature living amongst other biological creatures that was in relation to this reverberating viral reality began to kind of set in. So what I call the epidemiological view of society is sort of predicated on this, that society isn't just a bunch of signs and symbols, that there is a deeper biochemical circumstance that is fundamentally indifferent to the kinds of cultural narratives that we may try to project upon it, moral narratives of redemption or salvation or judgment. And it's one in which we might see our own position within this, as in a pandemic, as more of a node in a larger network of vectors. And as I discuss a little bit later in the book, I think that also has implications for how we even think about, how we think about ourselves as an object as opposed to a subject, how we think about our kinds of responsibilities and obligations to one another, how we think about the fundamental constitution of what we imagine a planetary condition to be. And in essence, I think it's one of the lessons from the pandemic that we should hold on to. One of the things that was revealed by the pandemic and was made very clear to a lot of people was this circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Keller Easterling said like a decoder ring that was laid across our understanding of a global population, that understandings of nation states started dissolving a bit or were defined by different things than simply border control.
To some extent, yes. I mean, I agree with Keller's point on the idea that in many respects, we sort of see the pandemic as something that kind of revealed a lot of underlying conditions, right? A lot of things were kind of laid bare. Veils were taken away and circumstances as they are were made more explicit. In terms of the nation state, though, and I mean, one of the other aspects of I think the epidemiological view of society is important, is it also has to do with the importance of sensing and modeling of the situation, right? The way epidemiologists might view a society and the way we see society through these various interfaces that we were all staring at early on in the pandemic is because there's different moments in which it's possible to sense and identify places where the virus might be, and to produce predictive models of that. And so this lesson as well of how a society is able to sense and make sense of itself, to produce models of itself as a way of acting back upon itself in order to care for itself, in order to, provide healthcare, in order to do all these kinds of things, became a kind of non-negotiable sense of how it is all of this would work. Now, that in many ways is what I mean by post-pandemic politics, is this ability for society to sense and make sense of itself in ways that would be toward a liberation of public reason. Unfortunately, I think that, one of the ways in which the role of the nation state within this worked rather differently was we also had this very strange kind of, this fundamental sociological fact of the pandemic was that everyone was sent home to their country of passport. Mm-hmm. Once the music stopped, everyone were sort of like the Brazilians go back to Brazil, the Koreans go back to Korea, the Serbians go back to Serbia. And instead of it being, the virus certainly doesn't care about national borders. We do.
Right.
And
yes.
One of the things that's revealed, I think, it was not only the tenacity of the Westphalian state model to monopolize our imagination about how it is that we might organize ourselves and care for ourselves and try to intervene in what is obviously a planetary scale crisis or situation. When push comes to shove, we don't know what else to do.
The Westphalian state model is going to be very important for this conversation, I think. Can you, in just a few words, say for our listeners what that is?
Oh, sure. So what I mean by that simply is the kind of, comes from the Treaty of Westphalia, but it's sort of a political science term that just refers to, if you imagine a world map, and then you sort of subdivide that world map into lots of little colored loops, right? This is South Dakota and this is North Dakota, this is Canada, this is Japan, Korea. this sort of standardization of isomorphic nation state model that has physical boundaries, that has its own capital, that its own currency or something, that this formalization of the state as the standard format, which begins with early modernity, but in many cases really doesn't become truly, quote, universalized until the post-colonial era and after World War II with the emergence of a lot of post-colonial states. But the notion that, one is a citizen of a particular territory, one has a passport, that this passport is the condition that allows you to move between place to place. All of this is very new. All of this is very artificial. All of this is very contingent. And yet, in many respects, as we saw with the pandemic, it continues to monopolize our sense of what the political even means.
Absolutely. I think it's a very useful shorthand.
I feel like it's not a failure of imagination so much as these are convenient structures that exist. And clearly there needs to be some borders for any type of quarantining to happen. And it happened to be easily enforceable boundaries.
Yep, I don't disagree.
I think the truism, the virus knows no borders, I think probably no one would debate that. But I did like what you mentioned, that this was basically the biggest control experiment in comparative governance, that we've experienced. And I think that's true to some degree. And it definitely was at first. But I wonder if that's still true. I mean, don't you think that somehow it's become more complicated than something as simple as that? You wrote this, I guess, almost a year ago at this point, right? Yeah,
that's true. Some of this was sort of taken from an essay that was published, I think, last April, kind of in the midst of this. But let me unpack the point that you cite from the book. Another way of thinking about what just happened is that, as I say, we've lived through this largest control experiment in comparative governance in our history, with the virus as the control variable and these various, not just governments and policies, but political cultures as the kind of experimental subjects here. And in some cases, I think it is possible, and I think we will probably go back and kind of forensically reconstruct policies that did work, policies that didn't work in different kinds of locations. But that's not quite really what I meant. Because the truth is, there's policies that were implemented in countries that had very low deaths per 100,000, which is a pretty good metric, such as South Korea or Taiwan, that never would have been culturally possible in Texas or Italy. It wasn't a matter of a government not being able to implement a policy or, as you say, to imagine a policy. There's a political culture, a logic of what is acceptable forms of governance, what governance even is, what forms of deliberate social self-administration and self-composition are possible to do, that probably had more to do with the difference in outcomes, why Brazil continues to be a catastrophic situation, India, catastrophic situation, the sort of red states, America, still not doing very well. I think one of the clear outcomes is that right-wing populist politics simply doesn't work. Johnson in the UK, Trump in the US, Modi in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, that the countries that had the highest rates of deaths per 100,000 are the ones that were also administered by a kind of logic of populist politics that is predicated on the idea that cultural narratives can subordinate physical objective reality to their semiotic dominion in ways that the revenge of the real of the pandemic demonstrated simply not viable.
Why do you think that deaths per 100,000 is the statistic that should be controlled for? Because I mean, I think I understand the logic for that, but that might not be, maybe there's something more long-term than that, that can determine the nation's success that is more comprehensive and economic and sociological.
Oh, I'm sure.
And that we won't be able to determine for the next decade,
I'm sure of it. And I think it's a good point to make. I don't think that looking through something as complex as what we just lived through would make sense to sort of optimize for in any kind of regard. I think, though, as a rough metric for comparative outcomes for different kinds of conditions and different kind of policies, it's a good back of the envelope way of looking at it. I think one of the things that you do see here is that GDP per capita didn't necessarily help as much as you might have thought, that countries with very high GDP per capita had a higher death rates per 100,000 in many cases. And so it's maybe a way to sort of think about not only the capacity for sensing and tracking the contagion as a way of sort of, again, have a society being able to sense and model itself, but also a metric for how a healthcare system is actually able to intervene in what may be there. And certainly in the United States, one of the things that was revealed and made very clear were the inadequacies of our healthcare system, which is one that's organized around a kind of hyper-individualist privatization of access, which doesn't make sense in a pandemic in which risk is so obviously collective.
Just to sort of summarize that a bit, you're talking about like a miscalibration, both on the level of the individual or the citizen, say, and on the level of the state. But I know quite early in your book, when you're talking about populism subordinating the repairing of broken systems to a virtual contest of semiotic brinkmanship, and you say, this is how statues of war heroes can command more earnest defense than the bodies of living people, how viral memes of celebrity bodies can break the internet. And you go on and you say how these abstract symbolic forces that get a lot of populist traction end up being more effective than a very real material virus. We know that the morgues are filling. Can you speak a bit more about this virtual context of semiotic brinkmanship? What do you mean by that? And this is like the failure of the individual is participating in this populism, I imagine.
I don't know that it's so much a failure of the individual necessarily. I think that it may be a way of trying to give a more specific definition of what happened as well, I think, with this recent decadal wave of populist politics globally and the rise of its right-wing and left-wing variants. One of the things I think that kind of characterizes particularly the right-wing modes of populist politics is a kind of activist postmodernism in a way, a notion that reality really can be organized through a calibration of different kinds of social construction, that the fiction of a nation, the fictions of history, the fictions of race, the fictions of gender norms actually have a reality, a depth and an importance and a gravity for the organization of society, even though that they are utterly fictitious and artificial, and that should and must, subordinate the real. Okay, like this in a certain sense, maybe, the way we would look back on and define this right-wing populism of this time. And when I say that the conditions of semiotic brinkmanship, the problem is that one of the ways in which this has rather clearly poisoned all political discourse up and down the spectrum, left, right, top, and center, is that it has organized the question of the political around the question of the contestation of meaning and the contestation of signifiers, the contestation of signs, as if the contestation over this constitutes not just the basis for the organization of cultural power and cultural capital, but constitutes the organization of the real itself. As if somehow that this contestation over symbols is a viable substitute for the collective composition of reality itself. This is Bolsonaro, this is Modi, this is Trump, and this is, to some extent, any number of our friends on the left as well.
It's kind of a hard thing to undo, though, once it's been proven that it actually works. I mean, the right-wing populists in those states, the people who voted for these populist leaders who believed in this sort of representation over reality, they don't care.
They're not optimizing
that
for
people
that.
died. Yeah, they aren't optimizing. And it's actually the fact that the past decade has proven that people will double, triple down on this mode of perceiving and being in the world and actually don't care about death.
Because their representational belonging is like eco-death. The death of their sense of community or something is like a stronger force than whatever material threat is there. Or
I mean, I wonder just how you undo that, though.
Well, I think your characterization of the situation is sadly, I think there's a lot of truth to it. And, a lot of my friends in Brazil, the way in which they talk about the kind of flippancy that continues the tone of the day in terms of how it is that people are, the capacity for rationalization, the capacity for a certain degree of denial. I talk about earlier in the book, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, denial, acceptance, rationalization, things like this as well. I think we've invented a few more within relation to this pandemic, and degrees of rationalization are certainly, I think, part of that now. So no, I'm not disagreeing with your point that this has a tremendous degree of power, that this process has a tremendous degree of efficacy. That's in a way precisely my point. But at the same time, that doesn't mean it constitutes anything remotely close to a basis for a kind of viable strategy for how it is a planetary society should seek to understand itself, compose itself, administer itself, care for itself over the coming decades. In a way, it's why we can't have nice things.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to speak a little bit about, I guess it's more of an anecdotal experience within Germany, but you do hold it up as, one of the examples of the successful countries, specifically because their sensing mechanisms were so robust early on. But that wasn't really the experience on the ground. They actively were discouraging you from getting a test unless you had symptoms for a very long time. It wasn't until very
right.
recently that they had ubiquitous testing. It immediately got gamed by the mafia, where they're getting paid 18 euros a test.
Wow.
All the gambling facilities in my neighborhood are now testing facilities. It's a joke. There's, a tracing app. I have never been able to download it because I have an American App Store thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's been basic failures. And there's also, because the culture is conducive to it, they've really let the technocrats have full reign of experimenting with a whole array of very, very specific policies about how many people can be at a table and how far apart and things. And I can't say that any of these things specifically can be associated with the relative success, which at this point, I don't think you can single out Germany as a successful one, especially considering the vaccine rollout.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess I just don't know how to jibe my general faith or desire to have faith in technocratic solutions and sensing mechanisms with the fact that they just don't work in practice very often. So yes, you could say we need better ones. But how exactly? Because I feel like if Germany couldn't do it, it's going to be harder for a place without that political culture that's conducive to doing that. Much harder.
Right. So thanks. There's an amazing anecdote. The gambling place. It's perfect. What I mentioned earlier in the book was talking about, Germany was able to roll out some testing a little bit earlier on. Clearly one of the issues with writing a book like this is that, reality changes very quickly and this as well. And so there's the other aspect of what I'm discussing in Germany there's a passage in the book where I talk about the big anti-lockdown rallies that were co-organized by some of the big international anti-vaccine groups. Robert F. Kennedy's thing. Berlin was a huge epicenter for
Querdenken.
This kind of, interestingly, obviously kind of crosses political spectrum, not just anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown, but in a certain sense, a kind of anti-reality form of politics. I think the question of Germany is much more complex than I would have opportunity to really give a portrait of in this as well. Let me, though, get to what I think is sort of the heart of your question, which has to do with what's really possible. There were countries that were more successful than others, and I think that there might be things that would be important to learn from them. Clearly, Taiwan and Korea were countries that were able to be much more successful in a lot of regards. It's kind of amazing to think, but Taiwan didn't really need to shut down the schools for all of this, that the capacity for a kind of targeted testing and intervention, that the mechanism for this was such that the kind of excruciatingly vague and up and down and open and closed lockdown insanity that we've all lived through, this really wasn't necessary. This didn't have to be this way. And the questions of why it was is, I think, exactly what we do want to be discussing. Well, first of all, I should say is to clear up a kind of misconception. The book is not an argument on behalf of tracing apps per se. In the US, the tracing apps were a fucking disaster as well.
Yeah.
In the UK, they were a catastrophe inside a catastrophe inside a catastrophe. And part of the reason for this is just, it's not that the United States doesn't have the technological capability of building a tracing app that makes sense. Even the Google Apple one that was proposed really early on, just on the software level, would have been perfectly fine. Though it was interesting that it was a lot of the European governments that actually wanted to perforate some of the anonymization capacities of that platform. That was Google and Apple that actually pushed back, weirdly enough. The issue wasn't this. The issue in the United States was that the mobilization of the people who would actually be able to reconstruct those traces was something we have become incapable of. We are incapable of governing ourselves in such a way that the hiring and mobilization and training of a sufficient number of people that would actually make something like a tracing app meaningful in any sense, we were not capable of pulling off. In addition to this, there's also the kind of the cultural norm of a kind of hyper-individualist sense of self in relationship to a society and a relationship to a collective, that the very idea that you are a biological creature amongst other biological creatures and that the conditions of risk to you are actually collectivized amongst this other assemblage of biological creatures is just not something that, speaking in the American context, that we're capable of processing and acting upon in a way that would actually work. And so, to be clear, the models of sensing and modeling and simulation and administration and composition that I'm speaking of as the basis of what our post-pandemic politics needs to look like have to do with this. the ability of a society to sense and make sense itself and to act upon itself through compassion and reason, which will have to necessarily have to be based on, at least in the American sense, a kind of tampering of the hyper-individualist ethos. It's not an argument for a particular portfolio of technological interventions as some kind of deus ex machina that it's going to solve everything. I don't think that there's any way in which any kind of vision of what I call a positive biopolitics at a planetary scale can work at all without intensive capacity for technical intervention, abstraction, modeling, and capacity. But the real issue is not the technology. The real issue is us.
Mm-hmm. Another quote from you that I think is apt here is the extreme subjectivism that asks you to be the change you wish to see in the world, as if internal mental states cause the external world to come into being, is not the solution to neoliberalism. It is its pinnacle of it.
Yes.
And that is our Achilles heel, is exactly this extreme individualism that neoliberalism has asked us to hone.
Yes.
And I mean, in a kind of practical way, I am curious, like, how we see a way out of that when all of the apps that we're using, all of our interfaces are only further inscribing that. I mean,
right.
That said, there is this, what we call dark forest activity, which is maybe doing something else. Maybe we can get to that later in this conversation. But like, how do we see a path outside of this, especially when we're inscribed in these, as you've of course spoke at length about, these digital stacks.
Yeah.
Of course, TikTok is this Chinese app, which is now used, in the GAFA stack or EU American stack. But like, how do we find a way off of this pinnacle and not just make that peak go higher when all of our interfaces are reinforcing the idea of the individual, our devices, our quantification?
That's exactly right. I mean, this is exactly the way to set up the question for what a more viable form of a planetary biopolitics would actually look like. To sort of clarify a little of what I think you're asking in relationship to the book, there's sort of two things here. One is that there's a way in which I link this question of a kind of populist intensification of a kind of a narrative view of reality to what we might see as a kind of neoliberal hypersubjectivism, in which politics is understood as an expression of experiences. The way I see this in a more summary level is our condition is one in which subjectivity, identity, and agency are all conflated into a single thing. And so a sense of a lack of agency, the remedy of this is thought to be an intensification of identity or an intensification of subjectivity. That's not where agency is. And I think we need to sort of peel some of these apart. And that's a more complicated discussion. But to the question of planetary scale computation that you describe here and how it is that we actually enter into this, there's a longer discussion in the book, which you point to, that has to do with a kind of fundamental pathology within planetary scale computation. It is intensely focused on the sensing and modeling and prediction of the desires and behaviors of individual Homo sapiens, like of all the things that we could do with this massive infrastructure, right? I mean, imagine it kind of like this. Imagine the blue marble image, from the Apollo 17 spacecraft. Imagine this not as a single image, but like as a very fast forward movie. And you watch this, you sort of scrub through this, and you see the continents moving backwards and forwards. You see the volcanoes happening. And at the very end of this movie, you would see the planet do something very strange, which is to sprout this artificial crust, if you like, of satellites and transoceanic cables and data centers. The planet has become capable of all feats of communication and calculation and all the rest of this. And one of the things that the planet has done with this artificial cognitive labor is to figure out things like how old is the planet, but also more recently that it is getting warmer. So to put it directly, the very idea of climate change is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary scale computation. Without this capacity to sense and model and simulate the inhumanly complex forces that constitute this change in planetary biochemistry, this very idea would not be possible. So to me, earth sciences in a certain sense represents a kind of alternative path for ways in which heuristically we might think about other ways in which other sort of forms of planetary scale computation that might be more viable and might be more relevant, frankly, for the organization of a planetary society and the kind of positive biopolitics that it might be predicated upon. But what's the difference between that and the GAFA stack or the BAT stack or any of these things? Well, foremost, as you point to, these are the core unit of analysis, if you like, of these stacks is the individuated person, the single serving user. And society is understood as an aggregation of these individuated subjective experiences in some kind of pluralization. And to the extent at which we can intensify the boundaries of these, intensify the prediction of these, then the platforms will imagine itself to be working better. But this is a comically inefficient model of the way the world works. It's an inappropriate model for the understanding of the way society works. And so in the long term, thinking of the models of how it is that computational capacity, including the sensing and the production of data, might work, that is not predicated on the intensification of subjectivism in this regard, I think is the fundamental shift that needs to occur. And that's more than just taking back our data, because quite frankly, like, we can take back the data from Facebook. You can have all of the trillions of likes and unlikes and all the rest of this, but it doesn't matter, because essentially that's the wrong data. That's not the data that we need in order to properly organize society. We've spent all this time producing massive amounts of the wrong data, and now there needs to be a sea change.
And at great carbon cost, too. Like, we generated all this data, like, at a very big material cost.
That's right.
What's useful data? I mean, what did it look like exactly?
Well, it would obviously sort of depend on the kind of context. We need to be able to understand the conditions by which the basic provisions of a kind of universal services to one another can be constructed. There's been a lot of discussion, obviously, over the last decade or so about a universal basic income by which you're providing people with the kind of baseline conditions of living. But I think in many respects, the real discussion should be about a universal basic services provision, which is sort of rights to housing, rights to healthcare, education, so forth and so on. I think you can think of it on a kind of population level. There's kind of three ways in which you could architect this. One is that you're seeing with the migration, you could call them migration crises, you could call them, migration situations. I think crises is probably the wrong word. But what you're seeing is the waves of millions of people moving from one part of the world to another part of the world, so that they would have access to the infrastructure that would be able to provide them with these basic services. So you're moving the people to the infrastructure. Another way in which you can think about this is to move the infrastructure to the people. Imagine some kind of larger combination of the Biden infrastructure plan and a planetary Green New Deal and whatever else you think of this through in terms of a reshifting of the capital and infrastructural relationships between a global north and the global south. The deployment and the construction of infrastructures in parts of the world such that the migration of people to the infrastructures is not the driving demographic force, that access to the services is more ubiquitously and universally available. And the third one is the ways in which many of these kinds of services are more accessible to people online than they have been before. I think most of your listeners are probably familiar with the Estonia examples of logging on to a kind of residency capacity with this small Baltic state that allows you to sign signatures and do contracts as if you're citizenship without ever setting foot in there. The significance of this is not that it's now we get to pay taxes in small Baltic states, but rather that just as the cloud has absorbed many of the fundamental functions of the state is increasingly evolving into something that is capable of extending itself and providing services to its users and its citizens online as well. So the politics of the next century is about, in essence, some sort of Theseus paradox question of sort of disassembling the boat and assembling another one, of a disassembling of a current planetary infrastructure and the replacement of this planetary infrastructure with ones that would actually be able to have a really long-term viability, social viability, ecological viability, and just a kind of heuristic. I think these three modalities of people to infrastructure, infrastructure to people, logging on, so to speak, would be the way in which it would sort of work. To do this is not something that it can be reduced to simply a technological question. It's not simply a matter of if we just had more computers, then this would happen. But rather, there is no way for this to happen that is not itself also a kind of fundamental transformation of the way we think about the social logic of infrastructure, the way we think about how societies sense and make sense and model of themselves. And more importantly, I think it has a lot to do with the kind of recalibration and re-embrace of the logic of planning, of foresight, of coordination and foresight over longer periods of time, which means the ways in which models become simulations, the simulations become recursive, all the ways in which you might imagine something like earth sciences, which is predicated on, simulations of the past, present, and future of the Earth, applied to a far more complex planetary dynamic, which is planetary human society.
There's so much there.
Yeah, there's so much there. Thank you for that. Also,
Sorry, it was a long answer to a straightforward question, but that's what you get.
Well, yeah, what is good data? What is bad data? But I do wonder if all of this sort of, useless, emotive, subjective data that we're generating is going to prove to be useful at some type of like behavioral economic way of incentivizing behavior into shifting towards generating more useful data and less wasteful data.
It's possible.
But I can't help but get stuck on the planning idea. And
sure,
where is the capacity for that? I understand why that's a good idea to have long-term plans, but I don't see where is the social capacity for that? Do you see an example of that happening somewhere as a model that could be expanded on?
I also, maybe just to interject, because this is something that came up on the Discord as well, maybe an extension of that or an alternative to it is a lot of people really had a desire for practical examples or practical sort of speculative pathways to a system or a global society like you're suggesting. So there are a lot of but hows and what would it look like that are asked. And you probably get this a lot. So I wonder if there are any common hows or whats that you get asked that you actually do have a sort of idea of a concrete timeline or path or possibility for it that can kind of be your star examples for this.
We can use the term plan. Let's hear I want to have your 5-year plan or your however many series of 5-year plans it will take.
My 5-year plan.
Braden's 5-year plan.
Those are maybe two different questions. It can operate on a number of different levels. That is, there's an answer to the question in terms of the political. There's an answer to the question that might be more economics. There's an answer to the question that might have to do with the role of geotechnologies within this. And obviously, these are related in different kinds of ways. To the question of the political, though, one of the things that we saw with the rise of political populism over the last decade or so was also a globalization of politics that was probably to some extent unprecedented and not necessarily entirely positive either. But you can look at different countries, whether this is as I mentioned, United States or India or Brazil or the Philippines or whatever, and the kinds of shifts in political culture that were happening were ones that to a certain extent were more regular than they were irregular. That the fault lines were between urban educated elites and rural cultural nationalists and so forth. People like Steve Bannon sort of saw this as the nature of the game, that politics now was globalized. Not only that culture was upstream of politics, but that politics itself was kind of globalized, the extent to which culture was globalized, and had mobilized an enormous network around supporting nationalist, localist. It's kind of weird. You have a global international movement for the support of localist, nationalist groups. Whereas on the left, you've got a bunch of localist, sometimes nationalist groups trying to support an internationalist movement. And I'm not sure which is crazier.
Yeah.
I think that to a certain extent, and obviously I think you saw with Cambridge Analytica and some of these kinds of things, the ways in which I think on the left and in the center, this globalization of politics was received was as a kind of, it was scandalous, that this was a perforation or molestation of sovereign identity and capacity. I don't see, on a very practical level, any way in which we'll be able to address the cultural, ecological, and political issues that we will continue to be facing over the next century that are intrinsically planetary in scope, unless they are being dealt with and defined and acted upon at a similar kind of scale. And so the first thing I might say is we need to stop being scandalized by the idea that politics is globalized. Imagine transnational political parties with common platforms, with common candidates that would actually recognize this situation for what it is and to be able to actually kind of shift this where it needs to go one parliament at a time. I think we saw that a little bit with the appearance of lots and lots of Green New Deals a few years ago. Every sort of little place had their own kind of version of this. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about all of the Green New Deals, one way or another, was not only that this was a kind of radical left imaginary that was trying to deal with a planetary crisis of climate change directly, but that it was, in essence, a kind of infrastructural vision for how to deal with this, that it recognized that a fundamental shift in planetary geochemistry needed to be addressed at the level of planetary geochemistry, not necessarily at the level of the narratives about it. But one of the other interesting shifts, I think, was implied by this is the shift in the logic of politics itself, from a logic of that the political is the space where the voice of the people is expressed and registered and indexed, and then represented in a group of people who then vote for monies, which eventually down the line will cause some kind of effect. Instead, politics was sort of shifted from, instead of a kind of indexing of the voice of the people, the purpose of this is the administration of ecosystems itself. The function of governance is the administration of ecosystems inside of which all of our societies are embedded. This is, I think actually a quite significant shift in the logic of governance, in the logic of the political, and certainly a shift in the logic of what we might constitute a kind of a viable biopolitics. Oh, no, I also realized that Daniel had a question about planning. And, in a certain extent, I think that, certainly a number of others have kind of made this point. Just as in a certain way, some of the large multinational platforms may have solved the socialist pricing problem.
Such as Amazon
and Google, right? Exactly. The old idea that if you just had enough computational power, you could actually produce an artificial price because you would actually have enough information within the market. That dream of socialist planners has been solved by Amazon, strangely enough. These are companies that largely have been successful because of planning. Amazon is a planned economy. Google